If you've ever travelled on the London Underground tube, you'll notice while you're standing on the platform, that voice will come over the PA system every now and again saying, "Mind the gap." It's probably the same in all tube or underground stations, and what they're referring to is the gap between the platform and the tube or the train when it arrives. So there you are, standing on the platform, and you've got to keep yourself behind the yellow line while waiting for the train to arrive. Waiting and waiting until the train arrives, minding the gap. But what is it about the gap? So often in life we look at the gap that appears and we want to fill it. We don't want it to be empty. When you're driving your car, you don't want to have that gap between yourself and the car in front of you to be too wide for fear that another driver might jump in front of you. When you've got a gap in your day just because a meeting has been cancelled, we desperately try and figure out what to do to fill that gap. Send emails, make some phone calls, or work on a project. When we're having a conversation with someone over dinner or at a networking event, and then the gap appears in the form of what we call the pregnant pause, when nothing is being said and you're desperately rattling in your brain to figure out what to say next, we're trying to fill that gap. When we see a blank space in our diary, we worry at the fact that we don't have an appointment or a meeting or something scheduled for us to do. You see, gaps appear everywhere in our life. But what we've been trained to do as we were growing up was to fill the gaps, to keep ourselves busy, to be working, to be doing stuff. Instead of minding the gap by trying to fill it, why not mind the gap by keeping it precious? To allow that gap to just be there. Not to get stressed about it, but just to have it, to nurture it, to enjoy it, just to be in the gap, in that space in between the meetings, in between the tasks, the things you have to get done, and just be in the gap. Try a little experiment for yourself. The next time you're driving down the motorway during a busy time, move into the middle lane and allow a great big space to appear between yourself and the car in front of you, and enjoy observing what happens when that space appears. So instead of trying to close the gap between yourself and the car in front of you, allow it to be open on purpose. And then watch the other cars jump in and then jump out again in their pursuit to overtake the car in front of them. And for as long as your journey takes you, allow that gap just to be there and just observe all the things that happen. And instead of listening to the radio, turn it off. And instead of thinking about anything in particular, just observe. And focus on the gap in front of you. Observe all the cars as they pass you in the other lanes. Even though you're keeping to the correct speed limit, just observe them passing you by, weaving in and out of all the different lanes, just trying to get to their destination as quickly as possible. And watch how they drive up to the back of the car in front of them and wanting desperately to close the gap. And if you really want to enjoy this exercise, put a smile on your face and just observe. And what you'll see is all the drivers wanting desperately to close the gap, while in fact you're minding the gap. You're enjoying that gap. You're being in the gap while everything else is going on around you. You see, what people don't realise is that we've been trained all along to close the gap, when in fact we're supposed to mind the gap, to allow that space in between. It's in that space in between that the magic happens. I'll give you 2 ways in which this magic happens. There are times I get my clients focused on the kind of clients that they really want to be working with, their best kind of clients, the kind of clients that they really, really enjoy working with. And then I'll ask them to go through a list of all their current clients and identify which ones don't fit into the criteria of the ones that they really, really enjoy working with. In other words, they work with these clients, but they don't really enjoy working with them. But they do it anyway, and it's mainly because they want the fee or the income that comes from those clients. So even though they don't really enjoy working with them, they still do it because they get a fee from them. Now don't judge them, I'm sure you've got clients like that as well. And when I ask them to pass those clients on to someone else, even to a competitor, the reaction I get is shock and horror. They can't imagine passing the clients on for fear of losing the revenue that they generate. But typically after a long discussion, they agree to pass them on. But then what happens? A gap appears in their workload. And then they start to get nervous about that gap because it has to be filled. But if they just allow the gap to be there and to mind the gap, they discover what happens. And what happens is the gap gets filled by new clients. Clients that they really enjoy working with and also generally pay them more. Now think back to yourself. The times when you pass clients on to others or you removed clients that you were working with, how quickly were they replaced by new or more congruent clients, the kind of clients that you really want to be working with? You see, the universe can't give you what you want if there's no gap there. So while you're hanging on desperately to whatever it is that you're hanging on to, whether it be clients, relationships, clothes, property, business, whatever it is, you're not allowing a gap to form. But if you allow the gap to begin to form and then start to mine that gap, you'll be amazed at what begins to happen. Now, just like on the motorway, the gap begins to get filled. And all you're doing is sitting in your car, smiling to yourself as you observe all of what is happening around you, all there bringing you what you want. It's when you're like everyone else, trying desperately to fill the gap, weaving in and out of all the lanes of traffic, that things that you do want in your life don't appear, because you're not minding the gap. If there's no gap, it can't be filled with what it is that you do want. And perhaps you might be saying right now, but there is a gap. I want the clients, I want the relationships, I want the clothes, I want the property. I don't have them, so there's a great big gap. So what on earth are you talking about, Paul? And that's completely understandable. It's okay to make a gap when there's so much of everything already there. But it's a different story when the gap is already there and you're trying desperately to fill it. I absolutely get that, I know. But here's the thing that I said. I said mind the gap. I didn't say just create a gap for the sake of having a gap. I said create the gap and mind the gap. That's very, very different. So remind yourself of how I described yourself driving down a motorway and forming a gap between yourself and the car in front of you and observing what happens. Put a smile on your face and enjoy the experience of watching everything unfold and watching all the cars pass by as they desperately try to close the gap and get to their destination as quickly as possible. And all I asked you to do was to turn the radio off, not to think about anything else, and just focus on the gap in front of you and mind that gap. And just be there, enjoying it. Not forcing it, just observing it and enjoying it. That's what I asked you to do when I explained the motorway. That's what minding the gap starts to look like and feel like. When you're desperately trying to fill the gap, that's not enjoying the gap. That's not minding the gap. When you're like everyone else on the motorway, desperately trying to get to your destination, you're not minding the gap. When you're desperately trying to figure out what to do, consciously thinking about it, you're not minding the gap. Because just like sitting in your car driving on the motorway, enjoying the experience, observing what's going on around you, not thinking, that's when you're now forming a gap not only in the motorway of your life, but also in the motorway of your mind. You're beginning to allow that gap to be filled with information, inspired thoughts, intuition, insights, all from your unconscious, so as to enable that gap to be filled with what it is that you do want. And what will also amaze you is this. Not only will that gap be filled with inspired thoughts for you to act upon so as to get to your destination quicker, but the gap will also be filled with surprises that you weren't even expecting. Great surprises, all helping you to get to your destination quicker. That's what I talked about before, about making your connection between your executive mind, your unconscious, and the superconscious. But if you're too desperately trying to get to your destination and trying to figure it all out, you don't get to observe all that is happening around you to help you to get to where you want to get to. Because just as I asked you to observe all that is going on around you while you're doing this simple exercise on the motorway, if you were to do this without this one prompt, I wonder what is it that you would actually really observe? And that one prompt is to observe and recognize what are the things that happened from the moment you began to form the gap to the time you actually arrived at your destination that actually helped you to get to your destination quicker. When I ask clients to do this exercise, they don't see them initially because they're so focused on one aspect of the exercise instead of observing and taking it all in. But then when they're prompted, they remember the different things that happened which actually were of benefit to them, but they didn't recognize them initially. This is the same in life. We don't see ourselves and all the things that happen that are actually helping us to get to our destination until we actually bring them into our conscious mind. We're too busy seeing the gap and wanting to fill it that we don't really see what is actually going on. we're not minding the gap. So the next time you're on the train platform, listen out for the announcement of mind the gap and just chuckle to yourself what it really, really, really means. It's only then that you'll actually begin to realize that you're beginning to get out of the matrix. And when you do, life is absolutely amazing. So between now and the next episode, try that little experiment on the motorway and see what happens. And let me know. Until the next episode, as always, I wish you every success.